Hey everyone, this lecture is over Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find, the second reading for our Unit 3, the cause-effect paper. I want to give you a little bit of background information on the author before we start talking about the text. Flannery O'Connor was one of the great Southern Gothic writers, meaning that she often dealt with dark themes in her writing. She was primarily writing at the early to mid 21st century, so think around like the 1940s in that area. She was primarily a short story writer, and this is an example of a short story, a famous short story that she has written. And quite possibly you may have read this short story in a previous literature class or a high school class. It's a story that's widely anthologized. A little bit about her personal life. She was diagnosed with lupus as a young woman and died at a very young age of it. I believe she was in her 40s or 50s when she died. Never married, never had children, lived with her parents actually until her death. And she was pretty isolated because of her illness. And so she spent a lot of time writing short stories. She was also a staunch Catholic. And she grew up in the South where Catholics are actually in the minority, right? So most people that O'Connor was around were Southern Baptists, right? So very similar to Southwest Missouri here. But she herself was a staunch Catholic. And there's a story that illustrates her beliefs quite well. So when she started getting recognized, when her fiction started getting recognized, when she was getting publications and things like that, she was invited to go to New York City and dine with some very cosmopolitan folks that were they gave money to artists and writers and such. Because she was making waves in the literary scene, and these cosmopolitan rich New Yorkers wanted to be seen with her, and so they went out. The story goes they went out to dinner at a fancy restaurant, and because O'Connor was isolated and out of her element for the majority of her life, she felt really uncomfortable in this fancy restaurant around all these highly educated, wealthy New Yorkers. And so one of the people at the dinner recognized that O'Connor was feeling uncomfortable and allegedly, leaned over to say something to her that she thought, O'Connor would have interest in. And she started talking about Catholic Mass and said something about the Eucharist and said, "Oh, it's such a great symbol." Right. And O'Connor's response allegedly was, well, if it's a symbol, then to hell with it. Meaning, it's not symbolic to me. She truly believed that, the Eucharist is transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Right. So that gives a little bit of background information about O'Connor and what might be driving some of her writing here. In fact, the idea of grace is something that comes up quite often in her fiction, and I think that we can see that going on in this essay as well. So if we were to do a plot summary here, it might go something like this. A family is deciding where they want to go on vacation, and the grandmother is trying to change their minds, but she's unsuccessful. And so this family sets off to go on vacation, and through a series of events end up having a car wreck. And the car wreck just so happens to occur close to where an escaped criminal called the Misfit has been hanging out. And so the family is brought face to face with the criminal. And after a brief conversation, the criminal ends up killing every single member of the family. And then the story more or less ends. So the question for this unit, as we're reading these stories, is looking at cause and effect, right? So one question that we could look at, and one that I'd like to try to answer here, is what is the cause of the family's tragic deaths? I think that you could easily say that, well, it's the misfit, right? He's the one that pulls the trigger. And I suppose that you could argue that, but that wouldn't get you very far, right, in terms of a 3 to 4 page paper. So what we want to do is start back at the beginning and try to build a chain of evidence. So if we were talking in class, I would probably repeat that question by saying something like, if I ask you who or what is the cause of the family's death, does anything jump out in your mind? And typically somebody brings up the grandmother, right? And that is a wonderful place for us to start, and that will probably be the primary focus of this lecture. And I think that O'Connor would want us to focus there. So remember, with this paper, what you want to do is identify a cause and then build a chain of evidence that would support that claim, right? So your claim is essentially, if you were to argue that, your claim would be the cause of the family's tragic death is X, and then what you want to do from there is build a chain of events in the story that would all lead to that claim. So I usually refer to the grandmother as the awful grandmother, meaning that her character is not great at all. And her misbehavior starts at the very beginning of the text. The first line of the story is, the grandmother didn't want to go to Florida, right? So right off the bat, she's being contrary to her family, right? She wants to go to Tennessee. The rest of the family wants to go to Florida. And instead of just going along with what the family wants, O'Connor tells us she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind, right? So think about what O'Connor is suggesting to us, right? It's not that she has, like these kind of desires on her own and she's trying to negotiate with the family. She is trying to use manipulation and aggressive persuasion to try to get the family to change their mind. And that's reinforced in this first paragraph. Think about what the grandmother is doing here. She puts her hand on her hip, shoves the paper in her son's face while he's trying to read the sports section, and, as O'Connor says, rattles it right in his face, right? Think about how obnoxious that would be if somebody did that to you. That's what her behavior is like. And this is what she says out loud. Here's what she tells her son, the reason why she doesn't want to go to Florida. She says, "Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is a loose from the federal pen and headed towards Florida. And you read here what it says he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that a loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did." So think about what she's saying here. She really doesn't want to go to Florida because she'd rather go to Tennessee so she can visit her people, right? But out loud, she's trying to manipulate her son by saying, there's a criminal on the loose, and if you take your children there, knowing that, you are a bad parent. No, she doesn't really think that, right? She doesn't really think that. What her desire is to get him to change his mind so she can go to Tennessee and do what she wants. And so her persuasive tactics don't work on the father, so then she tries to put them on the mother as well. And this is a great moment where I think we're in the grandmother's head, where she says, she describes the mother, her face was as broad as and innocent as a cabbage. So if anybody compares you to a cabbage, know that it's not a compliment. But of course, it doesn't work, right? Her persuasive tactics don't work. And what ends up happening is they end up going to Florida. And in fact, the grandmother is the first one in the car ready to go. That's what O'Connor tells us right off the bat. So right off the bat, the grandmother in that first scene is causing tension, right? Is causing tension in the story, right? We get a sense of her character or her lack of character right at the beginning, her dishonesty and aggression with the family. Um, something else critical happens in this paragraph as well. She's the first one in the car ready to go on their trip, but she does something. She sneaks the cat, Titty Singh, into the car, and she hides him in a basket underneath her suitcase. And the reason why she does that, as it says here, she's hiding the cat from her son, right? She tells herself, right, she doesn't want the cat to be left alone because she's worried it might asphyxiate itself, right? She gives some kind of ridiculous scenario here, but she doesn't ask permission. She doesn't tell the rest of her family. She sneaks it, and the reason why she sneaks it is because she knows she'd be told no. And, I don't think the father would be completely wrong for saying, no, we don't need to bring a cat on a road trip. Something else in the paragraph that follows that, right? O'Connor takes the time to point out that the grandmother has changed her clothes, right? The mother is still dressed in slacks, like she's dressed really, really comfortably, right? But the grandma has taken the time to put on her Sunday best. So she's got a dress on, she's got a matching hat with a lace collar, and gloves. And she provides a reason for that. She says the reason why she changed her clothes is that in case they had an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the side of the highway would know at once that she was a lady. So we got to pause here for a second and ask ourselves, what is a lady, right? So typically the answers that I get when we talk about this story in class is a lady is someone with social status. They have some kind of moral superiority, right? Some kind of superior character. Ladies, you are probably told at a very young age, sit like a lady, act like a lady, speak like a lady. Gentlemen, you are probably told you want to marry a lady, right? And I know this sounds very, very heteronormative as I'm saying this, but right, these are the things that our American culture says about ladies. And so if you think about what that is basically saying, if you're not a lady, what are you? The opposite of a lady is not a man, right? Because ladies cannot be men. The opposite of a lady is, well, you know what? I won't say it on this lecture, but I think you know what I'm getting at. But think about what this is saying here. O'Connor's being critical of the grandmother here, right? So she's saying that the grandmother is essentially putting on a costume, right? She's dressing like a lady, so if anyone saw her from a distance, they would automatically assume that she has some kind of social status. She has some kind of moral superiority over other people. They would know that she's a good, respectable woman. But if we look at some of her actions before, and actually a lot of her actions after this moment, I think what O'Connor is wanting us to think is that title of being a lady is very surface level, right? It literally is a costume. There is nothing in her character that would actually suggest moral superiority, the moral superiority that she assumes that she has. Right? And in fact, this next section illustrates that quite well. So I haven't talked about the children yet. I think it's fair to say that they're kind of bratty. We're supposed to read them that way. They talk back to the grandmother quite often, and it might be because the grandmother is she kind of has that shaky character too. But I don't think we're meant to think the children are sweet and nice. I think we're meant to think that they're bratty, for lack of a better word. And that's illustrated right here, right? The son says, let's drive through Georgia so fast we won't have to look at it much. And that's, kind of one of those, flip it things that that young teens kind of say when they're not really thinking about their reaction. And the grandmother tries to correct him there. She's like, I wouldn't talk about my native state that way. And John Wesley takes it a step further by saying this really pejorative thing about Tennessee and Georgia as well. And the grandmother fathers with this. She says, in my time, children were more respectful of their native states and their parents and everything else. People did right then. Then she follows that line with a very offensive racial slur. And in fact, she does it again on this second page, or sorry, on the next page, on the third page. So think about what's going on there. Think about what she's saying. Children were more respectful of their native states and their parents and everything else. People did right then. So this is a common assumption that people make, right, about the differences between generations. They always assume that the previous generation is far worse than the current one. And this right here, this whole section, would be examples of logical fallacies, right? So if you had not had the opportunity to read about logical fallacies in this week's lecture or in your chapter, in your textbook, please make sure that you do so. So logical fallacies are errors in logic and reason. And they're quite common. They're quite common in our day-to-day speech. They're common in writing, and they're particularly common in the public forum. Politicians often rely on logical fallacies. And what makes them so tricky is on the surface level, right, they feel very logical, right? This feels like a very logical statement, but they're rarely backed up with evidence. So, case in point, there is no evidence to suggest what the grandmother says is true, and in fact, the evidence that we do have is actually the opposite, right? The grandmother sees no issue with using very offensive racial slurs. She does not think twice about it. She comes from a time where people didn't ask questions about that kind of language. But notice what she says, right? People did right back then. The evidence actually suggests the opposite. I'm skipping down a little bit. I want to skip after Red Sammy's. If you read through that section, what I would pay attention to is the other examples of logical fallacies, right? This line of Red Sammy's is actually where you get the title of the story. Everything that he says essentially in this paragraph is a logical fallacy. Everything is getting terrible. There's no evidence to support that. A good man is hard to find. No evidence to support that. And then this line, which sounds kind of familiar to things that you hear people say today. The old lady said in her opinion that Europe was entirely to blame for the way things are now. The way that Europe acted, you would think they were made of money. I'm not entirely sure what the grandmother means there, but we are supposed to read it as a logical fallacy. They're using really broad strokes to talk about the state of the world. And really, if you pay attention to the grandmother's character, there's nothing in that she does that gives evidence for this moral superiority that she believes that she has, right? And that's what this is trying to illustrate here. It's trying to reinforce that idea that she thinks she's better than everyone else, but there's no evidence to show for it. All right, well, here's another example of her misbehavior and another reason why she might be the cause of the accident. She remembers that there is an old house that she wants to visit. And she knows that Bailey would not be willing, right, to take a detour, but she's really, really itching to see this house. And so what does she do? She invents a lie. She invents a lie that there's a secret panel in the house and that there's treasure hidden inside. Because she knows, number one, if she tells the truth, Bailey would never agree to it. And two, if she tells the lie, how are the children going to behave? They're going to do exactly what they do here, which is whine and yell and scream and kick the back of the dad's chair until they get their way. So essentially, she knows her grandkids are brats. And so she relies on them being brats in order to get her way here. And of course it works, right? Dad is like, all right, fine. As long as you all stop and leave me alone, I'll take this detour. And unfortunately for Grandma, they go down the road and she suddenly remembers that they aren't even in the right state. Meaning that this road does not lead to the plantation. She had a blip in her memory, right? And that idea that she was wrong is so embarrassing that she ends up sticking her legs out really quickly. She kicks that basket that the cat was hidden in, and the cat, of course, jumps out of the basket, attaches itself to the back of Dad's head. Dad, of course, loses control of the car, wrecks the car, and then that leaves the family in the hands of the misfit, right? The criminal that is out on the loose. So we have this clear chain of events that one could argue that Grandma might be at fault for this wreck. So they meet the misfit, and so we asked that question earlier about what is a lady. I think we need to ask the next question, or another question about the misfit. What is a misfit? And so typical responses that I get in class: a misfit is a social outcast, someone who does not fit in, right, with mainstream society. And I always ask this question as well. Once we define what a misfit is, I always ask the question, does society need a misfit, right? Do we need misfits, right? Why do we have them? If they don't fit in, right, why do we need them, or do we need them? And inevitably, somebody always says that there is a purpose for the misfit. Misfits are meant to hold up the mirror for society, right? It shows the misfits show mainstream society its flaws, right? So if you think about that, O'Connor made it so this flawed woman, right, the grandmother, comes face to face with this misfit so he can hold up the mirror to her. And that's exactly what happens, right? Both of these two sets of people, the grandmother and the misfit, have their own moral codes, right? The grandmother believes that she's a lady. The misfit believes there's no pleasure but meanness, right? However, grandmother's code, her code of conduct, her moral code, is pretty surface level. It has some serious flaws in it, meaning that much of her actions do not align with what she actually says. And when she's faced with the moment of death and she's trying to, she keeps saying pray, pray, pray over and over again. First off, it starts sounding like she's asking the misfit to pray and ask for forgiveness. But then it kind of turns into this chant. And it's almost as if she's trying to remember how to pray and she can't, right? So that seems to suggest to us that she really hasn't done a lot of praying in her life, right? Again, that moral superiority that she has is pretty surface level. Whereas the misfit, he has his own moral code. Now, it's flawed too, right? It's just as flawed as the grandmother's is, but we have clear evidence that the misfit has done some real thinking about what he believes. The grandmother just assumes, hey, if I dress like a lady, people are going to treat me like I am a lady. They're going to give me respect. And I am going to just take everything as it is without asking questions. Whereas the misfit, he's asked the hard questions, right? He wants to know the way why things are the way that they are. And ultimately, he's asked those questions. He's arrived at conclusions, even though, according to the rules of our society, his conclusions are very flawed, right? He says, no pleasure but meanness. But ultimately, it's his moral code that ends up prevailing, right? And I don't know what we should make of that as readers. So let's go through some of the important moments in the text that we need to talk about. So the grandmother at first thinks that she recognizes the misfit, but it takes her an actual minute to actually say it out loud. She says, "You're the misfit, I recognized you." And the misfit tells her, "Yeah, I am, but it'd probably be better for you if you hadn't recognized me," right? So we know what he means there, right? They're going to meet their untimely end because she called him out. And think about what the grandmother starts doing here. She automatically says, now when she realizes the situation that she's in, she says, "You wouldn't shoot a lady, would you?" Right? You wouldn't do that. So what she's trying to do here is she's trying to say, listen, I know that you subscribe to the same moral code that I do, right? And if you do, I know that you wouldn't shoot a lady, right? And she says this, "I know you're a good man. You don't look a bit like you have common blood. I know you must come from nice people." So really think about what she's saying there, right? You don't look a bit like you have common blood, right? We should kind of be offended by what she's saying there. And he says, "Yeah, actually I came from the finest people in the world." So she is really talking about class here. And he's not, right? He's saying, yeah, I do come from good people, but not in the way that you're talking about, right? But really what she's doing here is she's trying to negotiate for her life, right? If you recognize me as being a lady, there's no way that you can shoot me. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work for her based on what we get a sense of that that starts here. So essentially the misfit is trying to tell her, yeah, you might believe that, but I don't, right? I don't subscribe to the same moral code as you do. And she continues that throughout this text, right? I know you're a good man. You're not a bit common, right? There's no way that you would shoot me if you're a good man and you subscribe to this same code as I do. And the misfit follows her with this idea. He's like, "No, actually, I'm not a good man, but I'm not the worst in the world either." And he says, "You know, my daddy said about me, it's some that can live their whole life without asking about it, and it's others has to know why it is. And this boy is one of the latters. He's going to be into everything." So he's kind of making this comparison of himself and essentially the grandmother. So what he's saying there is he's the kind of person that's going to ask all the hard questions, right? He's always going to have a why. Why are we doing this? Why are things the way that they are? And he has asked those questions and arrived to his own conclusions. Again, as I said before, I think that we're allowed to question those conclusions that he's come to, but he's done the hard work of understanding himself in a way that the grandmother never has. I'm skipping down here. And in fact, he ends up telling us a little bit about his take on religion, particularly Christianity, right? Yeah, this is the point where I'm looking for, that he has done more thinking about the religion that the grandmother supposedly subscribes to than I think she has. And if you think about what O'Connor's doing here, she's saying Jesus, Jesus over and over again, and she thinks she's praying, right? But the way that it sounds out loud, it sounds like a curse. And so again, O'Connor is kind of reinforcing that idea. When it really comes down to it, the grandmother doesn't even know how to pray, right? But then again, here's the misfit who could pray if he wanted to, right? But he's rejected religion entirely, right? He's kind of like the prophet gone wrong, I suppose. And, you know, the grandmother tries to negotiate for her life several times. Notice that she never tries to negotiate for the family's life. And she gets desperate, and she essentially says, I'll give you all the money that I've got. And here's the misfit's response. There never was a body that gave an undertaker a tip. So essentially what he means there is you can't negotiate with death, right? Once it's your time, and there's nothing you can do about it. Um, and the grandmother has this moment right before the misfit pulls the trigger. It says here, her head cleared for an instant, and she says out loud, "You're one of my babies. You're one of my own children." And she reached out and touched him on the shoulder. So we need to pause here. What does she mean when she says this? She doesn't literally mean that the misfit is her child, right? She's realizing for the first time, and the first time probably in her whole life, that she is no better than the misfit. She's no better than anyone else, right? Everyone is on the same playing field, at least when it comes to death, right? And so all that moral superiority, all that surface level stuff that she has done her whole life to prop herself up, and all that stuff that she's done to that has allowed her to get away with, kind of having a crummy character in that she lies, she's aggressive, she's manipulative, she's a racist. She's finally realizing how flawed she really and truly is. But it comes too late for her, right? The second that she has that realization, it says the misfit sprang back as if a snake had bitten him, and he shot her 3 times in the chest. And the misfit says this: she would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. Essentially meaning that she, the only moment where she was actually a good person is the moment that she was facing death. So essentially think about what that means, right? O'Connor is forcing us to ask ourselves, do we need a gun pointed at us in order to quote unquote do the right thing, right? And of course, most of us can't live our lives that way, nor should we live our lives that way, right? We're on our own to make those kinds of decisions. And this ends in an interesting place where one of the misfit sidekicks says some fun, and the misfit replies, "Shut up, Bobby Lee. It's no real pleasure in life." And I think the "it's" refers to what they just did to this family, which is really interesting, because that's the opposite of what the misfit says a page earlier, where he says there's no pleasure in life but meanness. That's the only good thing in life is starting trouble and being mean, being hateful. But he seems to say the opposite here. So, it's interesting because the grandmother is forever changed by the misfit. Unfortunately, she doesn't get the opportunity to live out this change, but the misfit does. So in other words, I think the misfit is forever changed by his encounters with the grandmother, but we're not quite sure what happens after the text. This could be a place for us to use inferences. So perhaps another question to ask is, what is the ultimate effect of the story? You can really argue that the ultimate effect is the family dies, but I suppose that you could attempt to ask, what happens to the misfit after the text? And is there enough evidence to try to support that argument? I'm not sure. I think that you definitely could ask the question, who or what is the cause of the family's death in this paper? And in order to do that, you'd have to form that chain of evidence. I hope I haven't been too unfair to the grandmother. I know I'm being fair to O'Connor's intent here. She wants us to be critical of the grandmother, and I think that this is the teachable moment that O'Connor is trying to do to us. Should we live our lives this way? I don't think so, right? But I think the other question the other thing that she's trying to say is we all have our moment of grace, and the grandmother herself got her moment of grace, but it just unfortunately she had her moment, and it was literally a moment, and that was it. So to unpack this text, what you'd want to look at is building a chain of evidence to try to uncover who or what is the cause of the grandmother's death. or the family's death. So if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk about this text more with you. All right, thanks.